So hello guys, welcome to my YouTube channel Med School with Shubham. I am Shubham, a third professional MBBS student, and I shall be teaching anatomy. I have started a series on embryology in which I am teaching embryology from the base, all the core concepts of embryology. So in the previous lecture, I have completed the general embryology and also started the systemic embryology. In the previous lecture, I taught you about the development of the phase, in which I taught you in this diagrammatic form. If you have not watched that video, I request you please go on that video first and then you come here. This video is about the clinical anatomy and developmental defects of the development of the phase. So let's start that. So what are the clinical anatomies or the developmental defects? So first, we will be writing the derivatives and the developmental defects together. So the lower lip, lower lip. So from where the lower lip will be derived? So the lower lip will be derived from the, see, this lower lip, it is derived from the mandibular process. So we'll write that mandibular process. Okay, immediately we will be writing the clinical anatomy regarding that. So if these two mandibular process, I hope you have seen the previous lecture, the mandibular process were paired, and if these two mandibular process doesn't fuse with each other, then there will be a gap in this mandibular process, and now this there will be a gap in the lip also, in the lower lip. In this way, the lower lip also, the gap will be there, and now this condition is called as the midline cleft lower lip. Midline cleft lower lip. When will this form? When the two mandibular process doesn't fuse with each other, then it forms the midline cleft lower lip. The next is the upper lip. From where is upper lip from? So the upper lip, I hope you can see over here, upper lip, the green color was the medial nasal process, and the purple color was the violet color, it was the maxillary process. So it is formed from the medial nasal process plus the maxillary process. I hope you can see over here the medial nasal process and the maxillary process. Okay, so here also clinical anatomy. If both these medial nasal process, I said that this medial nasal process will rotate medially, I mean the nasal processes will rotate medially, and both these medial nasal process will now fuse with each other. So if this fusion doesn't take place, then there will be a cleft or a discontinuation in the midline of the upper lip. So this is called as the midline cleft upper lip. It was midline cleft lower lip, this is midline cleft upper lip. Now next thing, what will happen? If the maxillary process, it started growing, it touched the lateral nasal process, but it doesn't fuse with the medial nasal process. Means there is a breach between the medial nasal process and the maxillary process. If it doesn't fuses with each other, either on this side or on this side or on both the side, then what will happen? If this fusion doesn't take place on both the side, then it is called as the ipsilateral cleft of the upper lip. If it takes place on one side, if it takes place on either one side, assume that it takes place on this side. So if it takes place on this side, then over here you will get a breach over here or a discontinuation, because the joining between the maxillary process and the medial nasal process has not taken place. So here there will be a cleft. So it is called as ipsilateral cleft upper lip. ipsilateral cleft upper lip. If this breach takes place on both the sides, if this joining doesn't take place on both the sides, then it is called as bilateral cleft upper lip. If this joining doesn't take place on both the sides, even here and even here, then on both the sides the cleft will be there, and this is called as the bilateral cleft upper lip. Okay. Now the third thing, we'll be having the ala of the nose. Ala of the nose. So from where will the ala of the nose form? This is the ala of the nose. It will be forming from the lateral nasal process. I hope this is fair. One more thing. I have just drawn the purple color over here, but actually this entire thing is formed from the maxillary process in this way. Okay. And the remaining thing is formed from the frontonasal process. Okay. So the ala of the nose, over here, it is formed from the lateral nasal process. Lateral nasal process. Okay. Now what will happen if this maxillary process doesn't touches or doesn't fuses with the lateral nasal process? I said that it should touch or it should somewhat fuse with the lateral nasal process, but ultimately it should join with the medial nasal process. But if doesn't touches or doesn't fuse with the lateral nasal process, what will happen? See, this fusion will not take place. There will be a breach over here between the lateral nasal process and the maxillary process. That is, from the eye region till the nose region, there will be a line over here. In this way, from the eye till the nose, this breach will be there. Okay, and this is called as the this condition is called as the oblique facial cleft, because now the cleft or the breach will be seen in the face. Now in this region the cleft will be seen on the face, that is from eye till the ala of the nose in this way. See, from eye till the ala of the nose in this way. So this is called as the oblique facial cleft. And what will happen because of that? I hope if you have studied the head and neck topic, you can very well relate this, that from the eye to the nose you have a duct which is called as the nasolacrimal duct, and because of this oblique facial cleft, the nasolacrimal duct will get exposed. So this will cause exposed nasolacrimal duct, the exposed nasolacrimal duct. I hope this is very clear to you guys. This was about the clinical anatomy or the different or the developmental defects of the development of the face. So let's revise everything from starting. So the mesodermal thickening, I have made this flow chart to revise everything very easily. So this is the mesodermal thickening. So mesodermal thickening, from the mesodermal thickening we got a frontonasal process. Then inside the frontonasal process we had the nasal placoids, and from the first pharyngeal arch we got the maxillary process, and from the maxillary process it gave rise to the from the first pharyngeal arch we got the mandibular process, and from the mandibular process we got the maxillary process. Okay. Now the frontonasal process, now the nasal placoids, it further developed to form the nasal pits. Now the frontonasal process and the nasal pits together, the borders of the nasal pits will get swelled up or thickened, and now it will form the medial nasal process and the lateral nasal process. The medial nasal process and the lateral nasal process. Now in the maxillary process and the mandibular process. Now medial nasal process and the maxillary process. Medial nasal process and the maxillary process will form the upper lip. Then the medial nasal process and the lateral nasal process will form the nose. Then the maxillary process and the mandibular process will form the angle of the mouth and the cheek, and the mandibular process will form the lower lip and the lower jawbone, and the lateral nasal process and the maxillary process will form the nasolacrimal furrow and the nasolacrimal duct. This might be you might be feeling a bit confused due to this flow chart, but you compare this diagram with that flowchart, everything will be very crystal clear. So let's revise over here. So for the development of the face, we need 5 components: the frontonasal process, the mandibular process, and the maxillary process. Then first we have 2 mandibular process, those will fuse together to form a single mandibular process, and we have the frontonasal process. Inside that we have the nasal placoids. Now from the mandibular process we will get the maxillary process. In the next step, what will happen? The nasal placoids will become nasal pits. Nasal placoids were here, it came a bit medial and now it formed nasal pits. Now what will happen? The maxillary process got even more further developed, it started growing further. Now next thing what will happen? The borders of the nasal pits, it start becoming thickening or it will get swelled up, and now it will form the nasal processes. On the lateral side we have the lateral nasal process, on the medial side we have the medial nasal process. Now what will happen? The maxillary process starts growing. It will now touch the lateral nasal process, but ultimately it will fuse with the medial nasal process. Similarly here, it will start growing. It will touch the lateral nasal process and it will ultimately fuse with the medial nasal process. And now it will give rise to various structures in the face. The upper lip will be formed from the medial nasal process and the maxillary process. The lower lip will be formed from the mandibular process. The ala of the nose will be formed from the lateral nasal process, and the middle part of the nose and the philtrum and the middle part of the lip will be formed from the medial nasal process. I hope this is very clear to you guys. Let's talk about the clinical anatomy now. So the clinical anatomy, the lower lip will form by the mandibular process. If the 2 mandibular process doesn't fuse with each other, then if the 2 mandibular process doesn't fuse with each other, then there will be a breach in the lower lip. This is called as the midline cleft in the lower lip. This is the lower lip. In the midline there will be a cleft. So midline cleft, lower lip. In the upper lip is formed from the medial nasal process. See, this upper lip is formed from the medial nasal process and the maxillary process. So if the what will happen? The first thing is the midline cleft of the upper lip. If both the medial nasal process doesn't fuse with each other, then it will cause the midline cleft of the upper lip. If the medial nasal process doesn't fuse with the maxillary process, it will cause the ipsilateral cleft of the upper lip if only one side takes place. If both the side takes place, then it is called as bilateral cleft of the upper lip. Bilateral means on both the sides. Ipsilateral means that side where the defect has taken place. Contralateral means defect has taken place in one side and the effect is seen on the other side. That is called contralateral. Means same side means ipsilateral, different side or the opposite side means contralateral. So here it is the same side, therefore ipsilateral cleft of the upper lip. Then third we have the ala of the nose. Ala of the nose will be formed from the lateral nasal process, and if the maxillary process doesn't fuse with the lateral nasal process, we will get the oblique facial cleft. That is, in this region the facial cleft will be seen. This is called as oblique facial cleft. So what will happen in that? The exposed nasolacrimal duct will take place. So this was all about the development of the face and its clinical anatomy. I hope you have understood all the concepts regarding the development of the face. So please like my video, share my video, and also subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much guys.